everybody, Dan Bailey here, and this is episode 6 of my Fujifilm retrospective, where I'm looking back at my 10-year journey shooting with the Fujifilm X Series cameras. It's been a really fun trip down memory lane for me, but it's also been awesome to read your comments and hear about your own journeys with the X Series. So thanks to everybody who's taken the time to leave a comment, and also thanks to everybody who's joined me as a new subscriber. In fact, my YouTube channel just hit 10,000 subscribers this week, which is a pretty exciting and humbling milestone for me. So thanks to everybody who's tuned in so far. I'm glad you guys are enjoying the series. We've got another big episode today. A lot happened in 2017. But before I get started, just want to mention my Photography on the Brain video lesson series. This is my exclusive course. It's 30 lessons where we dive deeply and explore photography and creativity on a much more cerebral level than we do here on the YouTube channel. We talk about all kinds of different concepts, and I give you assignments that encourage and inspire you to try applying these concepts to your own image making. And it's not always easy, and that's the point. It requires a lot of thought because photography in itself is a very brain-intensive activity. So if you're interested in exploring some new creative ideas that will challenge you as you're developing your own style, you can find it right here at this link. Okay, let's get started. In the beginning of 2017, Fujifilm was going on its 6th year with the X Series. And in January, they released 2 new cameras. They released the X100F, which was the 4th generation of the X100. It had a brand new sensor. It also had the same AF selector joystick that first showed up in the X Pro 2 and the X-T2. It also had a much faster autofocus system than previous models and faster continuous shooting. So with all those advancements, the X100 was becoming quite the capable little camera. In addition, Fujifilm announced the successor to the popular X-T10, and this was the X-T20. So essentially it was the little brother to the X-T2. It had the same sensor, the same processor, the same autofocus system. So a lot of those creative features that were first introduced in the X Pro 2 and the X-T2 were now trickling down into the X-T20. The only thing it didn't have was the AF joystick, but it did have some brand new touchscreen features which allowed AF selection via the touchscreen. You could just point to where you wanted the autofocus to track your subject on the screen. We had a good winter in 2017 here in Anchorage, Alaska. It started off very cold, as it usually does. January we had an amazing display of hoarfrost. And you get that when you have a combination of ice fog during the day and clear, cold nights. And so all the condensation freezes and keeps building up, and you end up with this thick layer of white on everything. The tree branches look like white Cheetos, and it's just really beautiful time to photograph. So I spent a lot of time on my fat bike that winter, doing long rides with my X-T2 and just photographing the landscape and photographing the amazing winter light that we have during that time of year. For a lot of those rides, I was taking the little 18mm f2 lens. It's just a really tiny wide-angle lens, and so I was a perfect companion for the X-T2 to go light and fast. That month we did 2 overnight fat bike trips where we'd ride our bikes out and camp out in the middle of the Alaska wilderness. And of course this was an excellent opportunity to test the cold weather capabilities of the X-T2. And I found that it passed with flying colors. In fact, there was one night, it was probably minus 10 degrees, where I just left the camera on the tripod all night long. And the next morning I woke up and it was all covered in hoarfrost, and I turned it on and it actually turned on, and then the battery promptly died. So I put a new battery in the camera and I turned it on again and it worked fine. The autofocus on the 18mm was a little squeaky. Those lenses will work when it's really cold, but the lubrications kind of seal up, and the 18 is not weather sealed, so it's not really designed to be used in extreme conditions. But nonetheless, the system worked. The X-T2 and the 18mm lens worked just fine in the really cold temperatures that we had that weekend. In fact, I think the second morning that we were out there, it was 20 below, and same thing, left the camera on the tripod all night. This time I put a glove over the top so it wouldn't be covered in hoarfrost, and woke up the next morning, put a new battery in, worked just fine. March was a really fun month as well. We did 2 glacier rides, where we ride our fat bikes out to these glaciers, and we ride around the icebergs and explore ice caves. Absolutely stunning scenery, and of course amazing photo opportunities. Just like a kid in a candy store, endless creative options out there. One of my favorites was capturing my friend riding around in these ice caves. Just incredible deep blue light. It was such a great opportunity to use the Velvia film simulation, which is tailor-made for these brilliant colors. And for these I used Fuji's 14mm lens, which was my favorite wide-angle lens at the time, and it still is. After those 2 glacier rides, we did a 100-mile, 3-day fat bike overnight cabin trip in the White Mountains near Fairbanks, Alaska. We had long days riding out in the wilderness. It was really cold. That second morning it was like 35 below down on the river. Just bitter, bitter cold. But we just kept moving, and again, amazing scenery. At the end of the second day, we got into this cabin and we were just kind of situating ourselves for the evening. My wife came in from the outside and she said, "There's a cloud outside, but it might be the northern lights." And sometimes it's hard to tell right at dusk. But anyway, we went outside and sure enough, it was the beginning of an amazing aurora display. And so I grabbed my X-T2 and the 18mm lens, and I had this little Joby GorillaPod tripod. And so I would stick that on the ground and do these long exposures, like 8 seconds, shooting with that 18mm. And we shot throughout the evening, and it was just amazing. We wanted to stay up all night long as it kept going, but we had to sleep some. We had a long ride out the next morning. But sometimes we'd wake up and just glance out the window, and you could still see the lights just pulsating outside, these big green curtains. It's one of those evenings I never forget. I also shot a lot of mountain aerials with my little Cessna that winter. We had some really awesome displays of beautiful pink light on the mountains and the glaciers. I've described this before. Wintertime is the absolute best time for shooting these aerials in Alaska. It's a lot of work. It's cold. I have to shovel the plane out. I got to clear all the snow off the wings, use a little camp stove to preheat the engine with a 3-foot piece of stovepipe, and then I take off, climb to about 8,000 feet, circle around these mountains, and then I open the window. So imagine going 80 miles an hour when it's like 10 or 20 below out and you open the window. And so I'm just shooting photos right out the window with my camera, and it's just, amazing scenes, but it's really, really cold in the cockpit. So I got hand warmers in my gloves and a thermos full of hot chocolate next to me. But for these images that I'm able to get, it's totally worth it. Even when my fingers are freezing and so uncomfortable because the blood's coming back in and warming them back up. Hey, that's the price we pay for good photo opportunities, right? Also in March, Fuji announced another new lens, the 50mm f2. When I got my hands on this thing, I immediately fell in love with it. And it has continued to become one of my favorite lenses of all the X series glass. This thing goes with me almost everywhere. I've actually got a full review of the little 50 f2. You can find that right here. And with this lens, Fujifilm completed the trio of their new f2 weather sealed prime series. And that was the 35 f2, which they introduced a year earlier, and also the 23mm f2, which came out in the fall of 2016. One of the things I love most about the 50 f2, aside from its darling little form factor, is that it focuses very closely. And so essentially, compared to the 56-1.2, which was a similar focal length, this little guy was half the price, half the size, half the weight. It was weather sealed and it focused twice as close. So I also have the 56-1.2, and it's a fantastic lens. But this little guy, man. In April of that year, we had the first Fujifilm X Photographers Nature and Travel Summit. And this was a Fujifilm sponsored workshop that was put on by Jack Graham and Bill Fortney, two landscape legends in the industry. The first one was held in the Great Smoky Mountains of Tennessee. And in addition to Jack and Bill, I was invited down to be a guest presenter along with Karen Hutton. During this 4-day workshop, we had in-class presentations, we had morning and afternoon shooting sessions, and each of us had the opportunity to share our own individual insight about how we use the X series cameras and how we use specific techniques and creative styles in our imagery. In addition, there were 2 Fujifilm tech reps on hand to answer any questions that people had about the gear, and they had every single model of X series camera and lens for people to try out as demos during the workshop. And they even had a couple of GFX bodies to loan out as well. And we even had a very special guest appearance. On one of the days, Yuji himself flew down from New York and brought Lisa Yang, who was the X series product manager at the time. And this was an excellent opportunity for them to answer any questions and concerns that people had about the X series cameras, and also get direct feedback about what people would like to see for future models and future firmware updates. And this was a really special treat, because how often does anyone get to talk to the general manager and the product manager of their camera company? And that continues to this day. In fact, I told you that Yuji is reading a lot of these comments, and he and his team are always very open about hearing feedback about what people would like to see in the X series cameras and passing that information on to the engineers and designers in Japan. Anyway, that was such a fantastic weekend. I loved shooting with Jack and Bill, 2 amazing photographers and great guys. It was my first time really doing anything with Karen Hutton, and we had an amazing time together. She's such a cool person. And we're both just so high energy, and we got along great. And it was like Jack and Bill, the 2 esteemed older guys, somewhat serious. Jack a little bit more than Bill. Bill's pretty funny. But it was like the 2 older guys and the 2 little kids, Karen and Dan, just like with their high energy personas. The thing I enjoy about shooting with Jack Graham is that he's got this enormous tripod. In fact, it's so big, I can just run around underneath it with my X-T2 handheld. We have such different shooting styles, and that's the cool thing. Everybody does things differently, and nobody's right and nobody's wrong, because everybody has a different method and different types of images they want to create. Anyway, I guess that Karen and I made a good impression on Yuji and Lisa, because we were actually invited, along with Bobby Lane, who's one of the other X-photographers, an amazing human being as well. We were invited down to speak at the Fujifilm National Sales Meeting in Florida. It was a little bit of a change in scenery from the glaciers and stuff that I was photographing the week before here in Alaska, but I flew down to Naples, Florida. Karen, Bobby, and I each had the opportunity to speak in front of the entire Fujifilm company. So all of the sales reps, all the tech reps, all of the in-house people, the accountants, the people in different divisions, the camera, lenses, print, Instax. So pretty much all of the Fujifilm US employees were there. And the point of all this was to allow 3 of the official X photographers, each with a different style, to share our own personal insight about what shooting with the X series means to us and why we love these cameras and lenses so much. And so this allowed everybody in the company to get direct feedback from the people who were actually using the gear out in the world. This was an incredible honor to be able to do this, and it also allowed me to meet so many of the people in the Fujifilm family, many of which I've formed really good friendships with over the years. In May, we took our first big trip of the year, and that was 3 weeks of bike touring in Scotland. This was actually my very first trip to Scotland, and I had a wonderful time. So after flying from Anchorage to Seattle to Heathrow to Edinburgh, we got off the plane, took the train to Aberdeen, and then we took the overnight 12-hour ferry ride to Lerwick in the Shetland Islands. Then we got off the ferry, rode 30 miles to the next ferry, jumped on that, rode 17 miles to the next ferry, and finally landed on the island of Unst. We spent about 3 days on Unst visiting some friends of friends that we met, and then also riding our bikes and camping all the way at the very northern edge of the island. The Shetland Islands are way up there in the North Atlantic. In fact, the northernmost island of Unst is closer to Norway than it is to Edinburgh. There's a lot of Viking influence up there in the Shetland Islands. In fact, the Shetlands were their first stop after leaving Norway on their way across to Iceland, Greenland, and eventually over to Newfoundland. There's a lot of Viking influence up there in the Shetland Islands. In fact, it was pretty much their first stop when they headed west across the North Atlantic. At one point, we even came across an old Viking ship that had been restored. It was right there on the island of Unst. And of course, my wife, who was of Norwegian and Viking descent, felt totally at home getting right up there and taking the helm. After we came back from the Shetlands, we made our way over to the town of Aviemore, where we met up with my friend Colin, who I'd met online. He was one of my followers, who had bought one of my ebooks, in fact. Of course, I'd never met Colin in person or seen any pictures of him, so when this strange man with a Scottish accent came up in a white van, we naturally jumped right in with him. We hung out with Colin for a few days, cycling up around the northwest coast of Scotland, and eventually we made our way back to Aviemore, where we finished the trip by doing a 3-day, 66-mile total bikepacking adventure on what's considered the Cairngorms Loop Inner Loop. The Cairngorms Mountain Loop is an established 180-mile bikepacking route that follows 2 loops around the area. So we did the Inner Loop, which is about 66 miles. It was a really amazing route, but often very challenging sometimes, with difficult riding, if you could even call it that. For much of the first day, we were pushing our bikes over baby heads. You can imagine just the size of that and how easy it would be to ride a fully loaded bike down the trail of baby heads. But eventually we had some good trails, and as I said, it ended up being about 2.5 days, 60 plus miles, circling back to Aviemore. Real highlight of the trip. And finally, when we got back to Edinburgh, I led a photo walk that had been organized in part with a contact that I had over there. We had about 10 or 12 people, as I remember. In fact, a couple of people from the US, Craig and his wife, who live in San Diego, they were there. And so this was a really fun opportunity to meet some Fuji users from a different part of the world and just help people and kind of do my teaching thing and have a lot of fun shooting with fellow X Series people. So that was officially my first international photo walk that I led. So for the Scotland trip, I took my X-T2 along with the 18mm, the 35, the 50mm, and the 90. And so that was my kit. 1 camera, 4 lenses, and that was it. After the Scotland trip, we flew back to the US, and in early June, I was scheduled to speak and do a couple workshops at Glazer's Photo Fest in Seattle. Before that event, Jack and Bill were off doing their annual Palouse photo workshop in Eastern Washington. So I flew down to Seattle early and hooked up with Jeff, who was the Fujifilm Seattle rep, and we drove out and crashed Jack and Bill's workshop. So that was a lot of fun because not only did we get to photograph some really beautiful scenery out in that region, it was another opportunity for me to run around in circles underneath Jack's enormous tripod. So after that, went back to Seattle, where I did 2 days of talks at Glazer's Camera for their Photo Fest. On the second day of that event, I did a specific talk about the X-T2 at a class of about 30 or 40 people, and it turned into an endless barrage of questions. How do I do this with the camera? Can the X-T2 do this? Well, I had a Canon before. Can I do this with the X-T2? How do I do this with Fuji? It's just like non-stop questions. And I was like, oh my God, like we totally got derailed. But it was fine because I'm happy to answer questions. I mean, that's why I'm there. But it just immediately struck me. I was like, okay, that's it. I'm gonna write it all down. So I came home and I pulled all of my X series cameras down and I got my laptop out and I went through every single menu item on all the cameras and I made subject headings down the page on this document. And then I just went and started filling them all in. And at the end of a solid month of writing, I had a 50,000 word guide that I decided to call X Series Unlimited. One really cool thing about that process, when I was finished with the text and getting ready to design the cover, Fujifilm actually let me use the official X Series and Fujifilm fonts on the cover of the book. And that was an amazing thing to get from them. That showed me I had full support, even though they had no hand in the process. It was all self-written. It was all my project. I published the first edition of X Series Unlimited on my website on July 12th, 2017. And a funny thing happened. It started to sell like crazy. I think like 300 of you guys bought the book in the first day alone. An even funnier story, there was actually a major typo on the front cover of the first printing. And almost nobody spotted it. At least nobody told me. In fact, only one person contacted me to let me know, and that was Yuji himself. And it was so funny because I didn't spot it all the times I was looking at it on the screen, and my wife didn't see it. I asked her for help designing the cover, and she can spot a typo in the rearview mirror on a billboard if we're driving 90 miles an hour down the road. And she didn't even see it. So after Yuji told me this, I immediately changed it and sent out an email to everybody who'd bought it in the first day. Please download this very important update to X Series Unlimited. And I didn't tell anybody what it was, but that was it. It was a huge misprint on the cover. The moral of the story is we see what we want to see in life, right? So after the book was done, I got busy with the rest of my summer. And I went flying, I went mountain biking and cycling, and I shot crit racing. I photographed landscapes. I even led some private photography helicopter tours that summer where we'd fly doors off over the glaciers and do aerials, and then we would land on the ice and get a chance to photograph these amazing surreal landscapes up close, like right there on the glacier itself. In August of that year, I had another event at Glazer's. This was a day of teaching photo classes inside, and then we did a photo walk in the evening, and that was a lot of fun. I enjoy doing these events because it allows me to meet and interact with smaller groups of Fuji shooters. And so we had a lot of fun shooting photos along the Sculpture Garden walkway and then sunset photos on the waterfront. And then in September, Jack and Bill put on their second Fujifilm X Photographers Travel and Nature Summit. And again, they asked me to be one of the guest speakers at the workshop. And it was during that week that Fujifilm announced their next camera. And this was the X-E3. And this was the next in line from the X-E1 and 2. I told you about the 1 in the second episode of this video series. The 2 was kind of lost in the shuffle because it came just a few months before the X-T1 was announced. And the X-T1 was such huge news that a lot of people just kind of skipped over. But the X-E2 was actually a good little camera, and it was still being supported by Fujifilm with firmware updates. So the X-E3 was the next generation of that model. And it was a really cool little camera because it was tiny. Again, the same sensor, same processor as the X-T2 and the X Pro 2. It had the AF joystick, but it didn't have the 4 thumb pad buttons that are found on almost every other X series camera. Instead, they came up with a series of touch gestures to swipe up, down, left, and right on the LCD screen, and those swipe gestures acted as function controls to make up for the loss of the 4 buttons. And a few months later, Fujifilm added those same swipe gestures to the X-T20, and that was a really big thing. So even though it didn't have the joystick, it had these new swipe gestures and you could touch the screen and choose your autofocus point selection. So again, a firmware update suddenly made the X-T20 an even more powerful camera, months later after it came out. So in total, the X-E3 had 8 function controls, the same sensor and processor as the X-T2, 4K video, the Acros film simulation, and it was the first X series camera that had Bluetooth built in. So it could use Bluetooth to pair with your phone instead of just using Wi-Fi. You had much more reliable and faster transfer between the camera and your device. In addition to the X-E3, Fujifilm also announced their next lens, and that was the 80mm Macro. And we actually had one on the workshop to play around with. It's bigger than the 90, but it does have stabilization, which the 90 doesn't have. It also has excellent macro and close focus capabilities, and the 80 is compatible with the two Fujifilm teleconverters, the 1.4x and the 2x. A week after the Oregon summit, I flew back to Alaska, quickly packed the bikes up, and we left for our second trip to Scotland of the year. September in the Highlands is a little bit wetter than it was in May, but we still had a great time. We spent 2 weeks cycling and bikepacking around the Highlands and the Speyside region. We visited quite a few distilleries, did a lot of whiskey tastings. At the Dalwhinnie distillery, I met my tallest friend ever, a 7-foot 1-inch man from Denmark, and we rode right by the Ardveriki house. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. This is the location that was featured as being the Queen's summer home in the Netflix series The Crown. It's a super cool house. It looks like a castle. It's a private home, so we couldn't go inside or anything. But it just sits way out there on the edge of this loch in this remote region of the Highlands. After 2 weeks in Scotland, we flew straight to Minnesota to visit some family and also squeezed in a week-long cycling trip down the Lake Superior North Shore. So that was a fun add-on that we did for our trip. We started in the town of Schrader and rode down the Joseph Munger Trail all the way back towards the Twin Cities. So 2017 was a solid year for Fujifilm. We had 3 new cameras out, 2 new lenses, and the 2 flagship cameras, the X Pro 2 and the X-T2, were still going strong. And in just a few months, X Series Unlimited quickly became my best-selling ebook of all time. So thanks to everyone who's bought the book and supported me in my efforts to help make you guys better photographers and help you get the most out of your camera system and your Fujis. There's plenty more to come though in this series. In the next episode, we've got another Scotland trip, a brand new camera, and I'll show you my best action photo I've ever shot in my 20+ years as a pro photographer. So until then, please keep the comments coming. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already done so. You can visit me on social media and Patreon at Dan Bailey Photo. You can visit my blog and website. And of course, you can pick up a copy of X Series Unlimited if you haven't done so already. Again, thanks again for your support. Have fun with your Fujis out there, and I'll see you for the next episode.